am with Microsoft. I'm a cloud solution architect. And in fact, I'll go ahead and share my slide. It's got some of my contact information. But yep, I'm a cloud solution architect with Microsoft. I work in an organization known as the Customer Success Org in a team that focuses on U.S. manufacturing related companies. So for those of you that have heard me talk before, my running gag is I like to say I live in the Bay Area, but it's actually the Green Bay area. I live here in Appleton. Marv, I am a proud graduate of UW Stevens Point. And I think there's probably some others that are on here, but I've been with Microsoft 5 years. As the cloud solution architect title is a bit of a generic title. And some of us CSAs have a background in maybe IoT, others in apps and infrastructure. Myself, it's really the data and AI space is really what I'm focused with. So I am here in Appleton. I work with manufacturing customers in Wisconsin. And when I'm thinking back, Nicole, when we talked about having this talk, it was before summer started, right? Might have been pre-COVID. And it was quite a while back. And what I had in mind was I wanted it to be kind of a back to school, what has Microsoft been up to over the summer kind of a talk. At that point in time, Azure Synapse Analytics was kind of more or less formally announced in preview, and it's been interesting to watch the product mature over the summer. And so the slant that I have, or the kind of the perspective that I want to provide in the talk this afternoon is around how Azure Synapse Analytics is solving for enterprise data warehousing, modern data warehousing problems, and also big data analytics. And what I hope to have landed towards the end of this is be able to just really show you how Azure Synapse Analytics is a single environment that is going to help you be very productive in enterprise data workloads, traditional enterprise data warehouses, business intelligence, as well as big data analytics. So I realize not everyone here has probably worked in big data analytics before. Lots of different definitions of what big data is. I kind of like one of the simpler definitions around big data analytics, and that is if I have a problem or a query that I can't solve in the time period that I want to solve it, then I've got a big data problem. Yeah, and typically with big data problems, you're solving that through different types of parallel processing or clustered kind of workloads. So let's jump into Azure Synapse Analytics. So I have a little bit of a presentation, and then we'll go ahead and jump into some actual hands-on demonstrations. Okay, so for anybody that spends any time out on Azure, in the Microsoft Docs, we've got a site called the Azure Architecture Center. And you might want to write that down if you've not been to it before, but you can just search for Azure Architecture Center. It's a wonderful resource of different types of architectures for different kinds of problems. And here's one that you'll see around the modern data warehouse. The modern data warehouse has been traditionally talked about in terms of bringing disparate types of data into a data warehouse where you're able to visualize with something like Power BI or Tableau or Qlik, building click-through analytics. The formula is really around ingestion technologies to ingest the data, transform that data into something that's usable, and then model and serve that data into something like Power BI that can be served. From the different sources of data, it could be anything that's on premise. It could be things that are perhaps coming out of a software as a service solution. It could be IoT data from Internet of Things devices, and it certainly could be from other cloud platforms. As Microsoft sees it, we would utilize to ingest our premier first-party Microsoft solution for ingesting data is a tool called Azure Data Factory. Azure Data Factory is a platform as a service technology, and fundamentally what that means is that there's nothing to install. You're able to go out to the Azure portal and very quickly create an Azure Data Factory, which will allow you to read data from these different sources and then load that data in, either at a very bare minimum, load that data directly into a warehouse. More than likely, you're going to need to transform and enrich that data into something that can be served. Some of my customers have strong regulatory requirements where they have to ensure that the data that is being served has security requirements, it has compliance requirements. So they may be wanting to do things such as use security to prevent certain people from seeing certain data, or do things like mask data so that those that are looking at the data are able to see a portion if they're not in a role that allows them to see all of the data. For the big data problems that I kind of mentioned in terms of preparing and transforming, you'll notice that we have Azure Databricks. Not sure if anyone here is on the call has worked with Azure Databricks, but Azure Databricks is it's a first-party big data service that is also out in Azure, right out there with Azure Data Factory. This is a technology that allows organizations that in particular want to use Spark clusters to work at data at scale. So organizations that have a sufficient amount of data where it is prohibitive for them to transform that, as they read that data into their warehouse. If there's a time constraint, as a real simple example where they can't transform that data fast enough to get it into the serving layer, Databricks allows you to provision a cluster of servers, so you can more or less kind of gang. I'm really oversimplifying this, but able to allow you to gang up on that data and hit it in parallel. So Databricks is commonly used. Databricks, for those that are maybe not familiar with Spark, Spark is part of it's an Apache project, so it's an open source Apache project. It also is a commercial software solution called Azure Databricks. The team that was largely responsible, as I understand it, for bringing Spark to life as an open source solution later went on to form Databricks. And so, again, I'm probably oversimplifying this, but probably the most sophisticated, the most advanced way that if you're looking to run Spark, you could do that. Databricks would be the answer for doing that. Sitting on top of these layers is a storage system. Very common in cloud computing solutions is to separate the storage of data from the technologies that it's either ingesting it or serving it. So Azure Data Lake Store is Microsoft's premier storage mechanism to store data at scale. Again, you can go into the Azure portal and you can very quickly create a storage solution with Azure Data Storage, Azure Data Lake Store, and this will allow you to have, if you're familiar, obviously everyone is familiar with kind of creating a file system on your PC. You can have a folder, and then in that folder you can have folders of folders, and in those folders you can have files. Azure Data Lake Storage fundamentally works the same way, where you're able to have what's called these POSIX style folders, which means you can put permissions on the folders and you can put permissions on the files. So without going into on and on about it's a wonderful storage system that allows us to separate compute from storage. And this is a unique aspect of cloud computing systems, is to be able to do that, separate the compute from the storage, as compared to what we normally see on premise. big data solutions that have been implemented on premise typically have our cluster technologies, so a number of VMs that have storage built into those VMs. And if you need to compute, if you need to scale your storage, you're scaling your compute at the same rate as you're scaling your storage. This is the modern data warehouse. The next slide I want to talk a little bit around is you notice I have this thing called Azure SQL Data Warehouse. And what Azure SQL Data Warehouse is it is a massively parallel technology out in Azure. And again, this is a very, very high level view of Azure SQL Data Warehouse. Azure SQL Data Warehouse has different types of VMs, if you will, that kind of run the workload, where you have a control node and then you have compute nodes. Those compute nodes have access to remote storage, which is really where all of our data is lying. So with Azure SQL Data Warehouse, as you can scale up or scale down your SQL Data Warehouse capability by it's referring to what we call something like a data warehouse unit, but essentially there's a dial, if you will, or a slider in the Azure portal that allows you to control how many of these you get. So again, back to a big data problem. If you have very large amounts of data and you need the SQL data warehouse to be able to query over that data at a faster rate, you can ask SQL Data Warehouse for more power, and it will provision more of these compute nodes that will allow us to query the data that sits in the databases in parallel. So a few terms you'll hear as we're talking about SQL Data Warehouse. You have what's called the control node, and that is really the connection endpoint. That's where you're going to when you're going to connect to the database. You're really connecting to the control node. You have the compute node which I referred to, kind of executes a portion of the query. So you can think of it when a query is being run, each of the compute nodes are executing a portion of that query, and then they're bringing the results back up through the control node for you to see it. To make all of this work, there's this concept of distribution. So when a table is loaded onto a SQL Data Warehouse, that data is put across the compute nodes. It's what we call the distribution. And then also just be aware of there's different capabilities to cache data. So it's been a while since when I get to the demo, just keep in mind that I've got kind of a cold environment, and we'll, like any other environments, as you use it, the caches get warmed up and starts to perform, very well. All right, so what I was just through was the modern data warehouse typical architecture. Let's take a look at what the typical architecture is for big data analytics. Maybe ask a question. Is anybody on the team here working on the call working with something like Hadoop or Databricks or solving big data problems today?
I worked in the past on Cloudera Hadoop distribution, but not right now.
So again, if you were to go out to our Azure Architecture Center, you would see several pages that describe big data analytics. And this is just a typical architecture. I'm not saying this is the architecture, it's a typical architecture. So the typical architecture is we bring in data from different kinds of sources. Quite often it is data that is streaming in to the environment through like an IoT device. Or it could be, it's probably an overused example, but like Twitter sentiment and things like that for marketing applications. But that data, because we're dealing with, generally speaking, large amounts of data that I want to be able to work through in a time frame that I define, I typically am looking for a clustering technology. So a technology that brings in multiple computers to solve those kinds of problems. So something like Azure Databricks, which I mentioned, which is allowing me to run Spark at scale against this data, or Microsoft's Hadoop implementation. This is a Hortonworks HDP. This is Hortonworks HDP, Hadoop data platform, implemented as a platform as a service. So we have Azure HD Insight, which would allow us to put up something like an HBase database, or do something like Hive LLAP queries. I can also run Spark. Anyway, this is the typical environment. Data is loaded into some type of long-term storage, and then I have these clustering technologies that allow me to iterate through the data and view. Fairly common with HD Insight, to be honest with you. When you spin up an HD Insight cluster, it's fairly common to provision it and then leave it running. It can be scaled up, like auto-scaled and scaled back, but generally speaking, it's fairly hard to tear this. I mean, it can be done, but it's fairly involved to tear this. When you're done with your work, when you are complete with your workload, to kind of remove this environment. So if you have something that runs every day or something like that, I mean, it can be done to kind of provision, wait for the time that it takes to provision this environment, do your work, and then tear it down. If the environment gets very customized, it becomes increasingly more of a challenge to make this a temporary environment. Databricks, on the other hand, does scale nicely. It can auto scale, so that when you're done with, if we talk about the cost, what do things cost in Azure or any cloud platform? Typically, it's there is data for with Azure, it's data that is egressing from Azure is where there's a cost. So if you're taking data out of Azure and sending it, out of Azure somewhere, that there's usually a cost for that. There is a cost for storing the data, and then there's a cost for the compute. Databricks does a nice job of allowing you to scale up and scale down, and actually turn off the compute clusters when that compute is no longer needed. But this is, again, the current common architecture.
Question, Chris.
Yeah.
That picture where you're showing both of the bricks and HD Insight, are they both being used in this architecture? Is that an either or?
Yeah.
And if they're both being used, what is one doing over the other?
No, thank you for asking. I put this together pretty quickly. I should have put the word or. I would say you typically see just one or the other.
Okay, that makes sense.
For an organization that is very concerned about being purely open source, HD Insight offers that, and this would give you the greatest portability to kind of move the jobs that are involved with making that workload run in HD Insight. Okay. Provides you some portability. Databricks, on the other hand, last I checked, there is no on-premise equivalent to this, so you're going to be running this in one of the cloud platforms.
Sure.
Okay.
Gotcha. Thanks.
So the point I'm actually kind of trying to actually come home with is that what has the kind of the state of the art, if you will, has been often you need to have two critical yet independent analytic systems built in an organization to solve your big data issues or your relational data issues. It's either an either or, and I have definitely seen this at the organizations that I've been part of, that separate environments for curating big data and separate environments for the enterprise BI. And this is what Azure Synapse Analytics is trying to address. Azure Synapse Analytics is, so earlier, for those who are kind of listening sharply, I was referring to SQL Data Warehouse. Our solution, known as Azure SQL Data Warehouse, was rebranded into Azure Synapse. So this term is kind of interchangeable. You still see this term either out in social, different blogs and articles, and probably a lot of Microsoft material as well. But we came up with this concept of Azure Synapse Analytics with the intention of having one environment that allows you to do experimentation, fast exploration against semi-structured data, as well as be able to kind of work with, have dependable performance with the kind of security and the privacy that everyone's come to expect over operational data. So data lakes and data warehouses. The kinds of things that data scientists are doing, or trying to build machine learning experiments over something like IoT data, as an example, really does require this fast exploration. If you think about the previous slides that I was sharing, very typical to have the data that is sourced, outside of this environment into the data lake store, and then from there it's pulled into a serving layer. So as someone that's trying to do machine learning or trying to understand data patterns, going to be a lot of exploration where they're going to be, browsing the data, the data lake store. Some of that data will be highly structured, some won't be structured at all, and they need it to be fast. So again, a little bit probably oversold with the term. Welcome to limitless. There's always a limit to things, right? But this is data warehousing, big data analytics, all rolled into one. Our goal with Azure Synapse Analytics is to be this limitless service that brings together these two worlds. And the last sentence that I have highlighted is the part I think is the most important. Is it's a unified experience that allows you to ingest, prepare, manage, and serve data for immediate business intelligence and data learning needs. And that's what this looks like out in Azure today. Let's think about this slide for a moment, especially when I was sharing the modern data warehouse slide. The modern data warehouse slide, I had Data Factory out there, right? I had SQL Data Warehouse out there. I had the Data Lake Store out there, of course. I had Power BI out there. And for those that have been working in this environment before, what that can cause is having to have multiple screens up where maybe I'm over in Azure Data Factory doing some work, and then I'm going to flip to another environment and get into SQL Data Warehouse, and maybe SQL Server Management Studio as an example. And then maybe I'm going to flip into another environment where I'm going to jump into Power BI. So you kind of get the picture, where you've got multiple environments that you're having to provision, manage, from a security perspective, scale, maybe, some of the security things around, for those that haven't heard of something called Private Link, which allows us to have a private IP address for some of these data stores so that they're accessible only from on-prem. Azure Synapse Analytics gives us really kind of this one pane of glass, this one roof that allows us to achieve those things. We pause. Any questions at this point?
If you if you want to type them into the chat, if you have one, and I'll catch them there and get them to Chris. Otherwise, unmute and feel free to ask.
Okay, awesome. All right. So
just a quick question, Chris. Just from you said jumping in and out from different environments. I mean, from SQL Server Management Studio, you use that within this environment. I'm just not sure how the SQL pools, or how do you access the data? Do you use a different querying language, or does it T-SQL with some interface to the Azure Data Lake? So just curious how that works.
Yeah, well, I'm going to definitely show you that.
Good. Okay.
So we're not taking anything away. The tools, in some respects, it's confusing when you have so many choices to access data. But yes, we will have a simpler interface that it provides. It's called Synapse Studio. In fact, I'm going to get to that here in just a moment. Some of the pillars.
We have another question here. Sure. Let's see if this applies yet or if it's coming later. What is the path for organizations who were originally into Azure SQL Data Warehouse? Is there a migration path? Like, how would you talk to that and moving from Azure SQL Data Warehouse to Synapse?
Well, so this is where it gets a little bit confusing with Synapse, because overnight SQL Data Warehouse was rebranded to Synapse Studio, or I'm sorry, Azure Synapse. So in some respects, it's already there. Maybe
So
a little bit of.
You're saying that if you were using SQL Data Warehouse, then you kind of are already starting to use Synapse.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I have a slide that I'm going to talk to a little bit about how things kind of conform, but to be pretty candid with you, some of it I think was a little bit of a maybe a marketing stunt to the standpoint of saying when it was announced. I think it was announced actually at Ignite last November. Last November, Azure Synapse Analytics was kind of revealed to the world. We've got this thing coming out, and then it went into private preview. Yep. So what happens with things in Azure is things typically, big things like Synapse will get delivered into Azure in terms of a private preview. So it's a gated preview. The product teams will work with people like myself out in the field to say, hey, do you know a customer that would really benefit from this really well? And if so, can we get them invited into the private preview? So they'll have the ability to enroll. There's an expectation that they work in the technology and provide feedback. And then they're able to, as we get enough experience with the private preview to see that it's performing reliably and not crashing or anything like that, then when it's ready, they will move it to public preview. So Synapse Analytics today is a portion of GA, general availability technology, and preview. Honestly, there's preview and public preview and private preview aspects to it right now. So Azure SQL Data Warehouse was rebranded back in November to become Azure Synapse. And in May, I think it was, if I got the dates right, in May we went into public preview. So anyone here with an Azure account ought to be able to get into Azure Synapse and start working with the studio that I'm going to get at. But these are the pillars that we were after with SQL, Azure Synapse, and in particular the SQL aspects of Synapse is, the best in class price performance. It needs to be secure, of course. We wanted to have workload aware query execution. What does that mean? It means we give you the ability to kind of govern workloads. So you can give higher priority to certain apps or certain users, and you can manage that through roles that you're typically used to with SQL Server. So you can define, you can give priority to where priority needs to be if you need to do that. To give you the ability to query over all data. And have an environment that is going to make your developers as productive as possible. So what's suitable for Azure Synapse Analytics? Obviously, storing large amounts of data is suitable. To consolidate disparate data into a single location, kind of have this unified place where all of your organization's data is stored is suitable. Shaping, modeling, transforming, aggregating data, batch oriented, being able to query over large data, ad hoc reporting, and using certainly SQL constructs that you're all familiar with. What maybe is not suitable for Azure Synapse Analytics? Well, certainly it's not really designed for OLTP, at least as far as I can see in the roadmap. So high frequency reads and writes, large numbers of singleton selects, high volumes of single row inserts, probably not the ideal thing for this environment.
Question came in that's kind of related because you got
sure.
OLTP there, and OLAP is kind of the question. Is there a point to having Azure Analysis Service Cube on top of Synapse?
Well, that's really interesting. And boy, there's been some interesting things going on with analysis services that I've learned as of late. But yeah, absolutely, you can certainly use Azure Synapse. Azure Analysis Services over the top of this. Synapse will give you a new capability to power your Power BI reports that you might not have seen before through what we call SQL Server Serverless. but I'm getting ahead of myself there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Azure Analysis Services still is very relevant, and in fact, I think, well, I'm going to get to a slide that'll talk about some of the external tools, but this slide here is really kind of attempting to talk about what is real today in terms of general availability. What things do we have in preview, and then our roadmap around what we have our V3 kind of planned for Azure Synapse Analytics. So the idea is when Synapse Analytics goes to general availability, because it is not this, I wish it was easier for me to explain this, and maybe it isn't as hard as I'm making it, but the things that are in V1, it's primarily the things that are SQL Data Warehouse. Come on, Chris. SQL Data Warehouse is generally available. So that's something that you can support a production workload around. And you've got some new capabilities for those that are working with us around, result set caching, materialized views, JSON support, dynamic data masking, some of the workload isolation that I talked about. All of that is currently available in GA. When V2 is finished, it's currently in public preview, those things will come into the GA as well. That'll be things like, the simple ingestion with copy, sharing, data warehouse with Azure Data Store, some of the native predictive scoring capabilities. But also the Synapse Studio, which offers collaborative workspaces, notebooks, Apache Spark, orchestration pipelines. So again, the point I'm trying to make here is there's some things that are in GA today, and there's some things that are in preview today. Make sense?
Sure, thanks, good.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to go ahead and build out this slide. What is Azure Synapse Analytics? And I honestly not a big fan of the build slide, so I'm just going to build it out. And yep, so Azure Synapse Studio is the single pane of glass that is going to give us access to all of these things underneath it. So from first of all, this Azure Synapse Analytics, draws heavily upon Azure Data Lake Storage, and Azure Data Lake Storage. It's optimized for analytic workloads. It offers strong security, and it has common data model support. Probably another topic for another day, the common data model, but I would ask you to pay attention to this because I think this is Microsoft acquired a firm a couple months back called ADRM. I'm not sure if that rings a bell with anybody, but ADRM is a company that makes data models. I had an opportunity to meet with this company 5, 6, 7 years ago, forget exactly when, but I was looking for a very comprehensive healthcare data model at the time. And the CEO of the company came into my conference room, and first of all, it was one of the largest conference room tables that I've ever been at. And he rolled out on a sheet of paper, this big roll of paper, which was the most elegant data model I've ever seen. So ADRM that company has been acquired by Microsoft. It's a company that really just made data models, and I'm probably oversimplifying that. And those data models are coming into Azure in what we call Industry Workbench, and it's going to be exposed through the common data model. And it's going to give us some really interesting capabilities to, once we have data into a common model, then we can have, stronger reusability over things like machine learning models, and be able to kind of commercialize those and monetize those models because, they're aware of formats. Again, probably another topic for another day. Synapse Studio gives us access to a data integration layer. So there's a data integration capability where we will be able to obviously attach to data lake storage, but we'll be able to attach to a lot of other data, data that sits in Oracle or Teradata or SAP HANA, and I'll show examples of that. That data that we have access to in Synapse Studio can be queried through 2 different runtimes. So you'll have SQL as you know it. So being able to work with formerly known as Azure SQL Data Warehouse. You'll be able to work with SQL to query that data, or you'll be able to use Spark to query that as well. So you'll be able to use Spark SQL and query that data if you've got something that perhaps is a kind of a batch processing or some maybe Python, Scala, R or .NET, data processing over that data. This is where it starts to get even more exciting. That SQL or that Spark can come in 2 different form factors, either a provisioned or an on-demand. Maybe you've seen SQL Server Serverless talk about this a little bit out in Azure, but the provisioned is just that. It's where you're able to go out to Azure and say, I want a data where I want what was formerly known as an Azure SQL Data Warehouse, and I can give it a name. I can put it into a private link, have a private IP address. So I can have a strongly managed data warehouse, and I'm really kind of paying for that compute while it's running. On demand, on the other hand, is an environment where that compute becomes available when I need it, and when I no longer need it, it goes away. So SQL Server Serverless is an environment where I think of it as kind of being paying for the query versus paying for the workload while it's being used. This opens up some really interesting possibilities. So this on-demand SQL, one of the things that it's really good at is being able to read data that sits in the Azure Data Lake storage. This on-demand SQL will give us the ability to read Parquet files or CSV files or files that are sitting out in this Azure Data Lake storage. I can read those on demand. So imagine you're a data scientist and you're trying to explore the data, and you don't want to interfere. You don't want your work to interfere with other workload that's going on. You would be able to use, create a quick data frame or a quick SQL statement against data that's sitting out here, and bring back a result set. The on-demand
question
sure
that might relate. Was my understanding that serverless could only query data lake via Polybase? Is that correct?
Not necessarily true. It's there's an open row set that you're able to provision. So I have some examples of that. But yes, Polybase is definitely something that is really kind of more closely associated with the provisioned. The provisioned SQL allows us to create Polybase, and that is a technology that allows us to read that storage. The on-demand has this kind of built into it.
Okay, but is there any relation or anything to be said about serverless querying stuff in the SQL pools?
So the SQL pools, you just introduced a new term, but this from a SQL perspective, the provisioned environment is now referred to as the pool.
Okay.
So the SQL Data Warehouse, which is now known as Azure Synapse Analytics, has a pool or a serverless component to it. All right.
Okay. Okay.
And from a SQL side of things, again, when the query engine realizes that there's no further requests coming in, that just goes away. On the Spark side of the house, it can be provisioned or it can be on demand. Right now, that works in such a way where that environment will time out if you give it a time to live, and if it's no longer being used, it just kind of provisions down. Across all of this, you're able to use the language of your choice, SQL to R. And of course, you can apply your security, you can monitor your jobs and things that you're building, and all the things that you need to do to run this. Next slide is going to talk a little bit about some of the connected services. So these are the things that are kind of embedded directly into Synapse Analytics. What we are trying to make seamless to the things that are directly in Synapse are our connected services. So, data lake storage is not necessarily part, when you're, it's a standalone service, but it's linked very tightly into Synapse. So you can build your data lake storage, Databricks, Azure HD Insight, Power BI, and machine learning. So Azure Machine Learning is our platform as a service that allows you to build data models in 3 different ways. You can build those data models through what we call AutoML. You can build them through a visual experience where you're kind of dragging and dropping, kind of like a Visio experience where you're building your machine learning models. Or you can do it as a code first kind of an approach, which is probably the place where most organizations evolve to. And then you've got Power BI in here. Why would you have Power BI, right? Well, Power BI because, as you're integrating your data and you're building data models off of your data, wouldn't it be great if you could start to visualize that data directly inside Power BI, and you'll see that it's embedded directly into the tool. So questions, and then I'm going to jump into a demo. Anything further? We good?
Yep.
Okay. So in the Azure portal, I have
we got a question.
Okay.
Oh, yep, I see it there. We don't see the studio, and although it is Azure SQL Data Warehouse, does it mean we have to kind of ask the client to sign up for like a preview?
No, they should be able to. They should be able to do this in their environment. But you can see when I type in, I'm in the Azure portal. I'm in the Azure portal and I'm in the search box, and I just typed in sign up for Synapse, right? And you can see a few different things that kind of land. I've got Azure, so this is probably what they have provisioned. The Azure SQL Data Analytics, it's formerly the data warehouse. There is the workspaces preview. So this is the part that's in preview. And then this other thing here, this private link hubs, this is around being able to create a private IP address if you want to extend your Synapse environment into your on-prem. Hopefully I didn't sneeze on you. Sorry. So
Bless you.
Yep. But yeah, you can come out here and just come into Synapse Analytics, and you're going to see I actually have my environment. I do have a bit of a cooking show because I have my environment as an employee. What I'm going to subject you to is kind of a more fully fledged environment, which is a demo environment that I have access to. So, but in the Synapse service, you can see that I'm able to, I can create a new SQL data warehouse or my Spark compute if I want to. And I have
Are you going to be showing something that resonates with those of us that are SQL people, like to see an ad hoc how queries work? Okay.
Yeah, you bet. So this is your starting point, is where you you use this to create your environment, and then you're able to launch Synapse Studio. So when you launch Synapse Studio, what happens is a web page launches, and it's signing me in, and this is my environment. So this is the place where you would do your development in the Synapse Studio. The Synapse Studio has a number of different hubs. So there's the home page here. There is the Data Hub. The Data Hub allows you to look at the different databases in your environment, or the storage. This is the data lake storage data that you have in your environment. I have the Develop Hub. In the Develop Hub is where I'm able to build my SQL scripts, or I can go ahead and create a Python notebook for some Spark workloads. I can create some data flows. For those that are familiar with Azure Data Factory, this is basically Data Factory inside Synapse, and I can create some Spark jobs. So it's organized around the concept of these hubs: the data hub, the develop hub. There is the orchestrate hub. This is where you're able to kind of connect pipelines, kind of be able to stitch together all of your workflows. I have a monitor hub. I'm sorry, yeah, I'm on I was ahead of myself. Orchestration hub, and this is where I'm able to kind of monitor the different jobs that are running, so I can see if I had jobs running. I can see that they, when they started and when they ended. And then I have a manage hub. The manage hub allows me. This is another place where I am able to actually provision the kinds of compute that I'm looking for. So if I'm looking for a SQL pool or a Spark pool, or if I'm looking to kind of connect to an external service, I'm able to do that.
Question in the chat: if we're in here, if we've done pipelines and things in Azure Data Factory, will they be in here? This is completely separate.
If you link to them, yep. If you just linked, we wind up kind of creating a link service where we link to them. Yes, you can. So I want to get away from my own environment because honestly, I don't have that much to show in my own environment. I want to show you an environment that's a little bit more built out. So this is a demo environment that I have, and it's a demo that we have that's kind of designed to kind of showcase different manufacturing scenarios. But so it's a manufacturing demo, and again, we have the home tab, and just like many other Microsoft solutions, you're able to get to the things you most recently worked on, or if there's things that I'm constantly working on, I can pin them to my homepage. But you can see that I can very quickly jump to ingesting data, exploring data, analyzing, or even visualizing all in this pane. Let's start with looking at querying. What I want to do is get to the data tab first. So in the data tab, I'm just going to clear this out so I got a blank sheet. But in the databases tab, I have the ability to register different databases in this environment. So the databases that I have access to, I can go ahead and register them, and I'll have access to them. And so you can see that I have a data warehouse. This is formerly known as the Azure SQL Data Warehouse, now known as the pool, also known as provisioned. In my provisioned data warehouse, you can see that I've got my tables. And if you're, again, familiar with working with Azure Data Warehouse, you know that this iconography, these icons are kind of representing different ways that data is partitioned across the data nodes. So I have tables that are here, and I'm able to come along and just do a quick SQL statement, and it just ran. I guess I don't have much data in this. I just picked one at random, but I'm able to execute a query, and I can use different compute power to execute that query. All right. Nothing real tricky about this one here. But the external tables, these are tables that are sitting actually out in data lake storage. So these are fundamentally, these are tables that are linked with Polybase. With Polybase, I'm able to kind of connect and maybe pushing my luck. I haven't actually tried to query these. Sometimes things work, sometimes they don't. Depends on what permissions you have in these demos. But yeah, that is a query that just ran against some data that is sitting. This is some data that's sitting out in an external table, which by definition is something that's sitting out in Azure Data Lake storage. So the point I'm trying to make is a good
example of ad hoc, like you can just run your select statements.
You sure could. Yep. Let's take a look at another example of an ad hoc. So with if I close out the pool and open up the on demand, notice what's going to happen here is I really don't have any tables. I just have external tables. And so today the on-demand is really kind of at the moment focused on giving us the ability to read that, apply a schema on read and read that data that is sitting out in data lake storage. My understanding is because at the moment this is only allowing us to read against that data lake storage. My understanding is that this is going to be opened up further, and other SQL data warehouses that we have, other SQL databases, perhaps Postgres databases, other databases that are out in our environment, we'll be able to use this to read against them as well. So there's a bit of an evolving story with our on-demand. So this is data that's, again, this is my workspace. My workspace is something that I can invite others to. I can secure that workspace and allow us to build projects in this environment. Let me switch over to the linked data. The linked data that I have some Cosmos databases that I am linked to, and I have my Azure Data Lake Storage, Gen 2 storage that I'm linked to. So if I just kind of expand this a little bit, as I start to kind of expand out, I should have had maybe Azure Storage Explorer up and running to demonstrate this, but this is data, again, it's sitting in Azure Data Lake Storage. That storage allows us to put data into folders, and those folders can have things like CSV files loaded into them, or something like a Parquet file. So I'm just going to pick one at random, but as I again look at this particular CSV file, and if I want to read that, this is that open rosette query that is going to allow me to read that. It's using my on-demand query engine, probably a bit of a cold read, and yep, allowing me to read that data that sits in a data lake storage. So as you're going to see in things like notebooks, you know, from an exploration standpoint, this interface is, you know, allowing us, you know, quick access to data that is out in our environment, but also giving us the ability to kind of, you know, try to make some sense of it as well.
Now, if you've got Azure SQL Data Warehouse, but you're wanting to understand what it means for Synapse, and you go spin it up, do you have to like link back through here to your things that are in your Azure SQL Data Warehouse, essentially?
Well, so I'm going to jump ahead a slide here, just to bear with me a minute.
If you're going to cover it, that's okay.
No, it's kind of an interesting part, an interesting point. This SQL on demand offers some interesting opportunities with, you know, serverless. So for the serverless compute, it's certainly allowing us to do basic data exploration. You know, what's in this file? How many rows are there? What's the max value? It's schema on read, and or automatic schema inference. If we've got something like a Parquet file where the schema is built into the file, I can explore that data. Gets even more interesting. Honestly, expands my mind a little bit. Is it allows us to create a logical data warehouse. So how to join data produced by various apps. I could create a virtual SQL layer on top of that heterogeneous data in the data lake. It would be absolutely possible to connect a Power BI data set to this. So I might not even need to load that data if my requirements aren't where it doesn't really come to the point where I have to, you know, kind of form that data into a physical data warehouse and load that data into, you know, the enterprise data warehouse. I might be able to just offer some reporting where you're using the on-demand compute to read at execution time that data sitting in the data lake store. Further, for those that are building cubes and things like that, Azure Analysis Services, Azure, you know, as we know with Azure Analysis Services or a Power BI data set, it brings that data into memory, right? And it's normally reading that data from some relational data store. If you have a business reason where you haven't really had an opportunity to build that physical data warehouse, but you want to offer that data into your analytics layer through a logical layer, you could do that here. So this is kind of a new scenario. In fact, I think I've got a slide here that kind of talks a little bit about that, where I could run this built out, kind of have a Parquet file. For those that haven't worked with a Parquet file, it's a very common file format for working with big data, but it's a format that combines the data and the schema. It allows you to very convenient way to kind of, ingest on that data. I can load that into the data lake and then use the on-demand pool to either pull that into something like maybe this is the process that's loading your Azure analysis services, or maybe that's something that's going directly into Power BI. That makes sense. Any questions on that at all? I'm going to go a little bit further on this since I'm on this slide, but this SQL on demand, because it's very new. Again, it's serverless. There's no infrastructure. We're really paying for the execution. Offers security. It can integrate with Databricks, HD Insight, Power BI, other tools. And it's going to allow us to read into these different formats, like including JSON files. To read, querying data with the on-demand, it uses this open row set. So this kind of gets back to the question about the polybase, but it gets to the open row set, whether you have a Windows style file or a Unix style file and it's escaped, different ways and whatnot, you can deal with it. And so, it's addressing that file where it lives in the data lake store, and it's defining how it's formatted, and then I can even put a where clause on that if I'd like to. I can do things where I'm reading in, all of the columns, or I can do things where I'm just reading in one column. I can even do things like querying folders. So this is actually a really common scenario where daily processing of files are dumped. Honestly, typically my experience with a Parquet file, but as new data, kind of the change data capture process is extracting data from source systems. It's loading them into a folder, and what we want to do is we want to use something like a wildcard to read through that folder of files and ingest it, right? We can even do things like wildcarding on those files. So, but let's get back to the demo a little bit. That is what. Let's see if I can find a Parquet file. Polybase. Certainly somebody here has done Polybase before, and bear with me, I should have wrote down, I think I've got some in the Cosmos. Yeah, in this Cosmos, Cosmos is a database, is another database service out in Azure. Cosmos is a global scale database. Again, I'm oversimplifying it, but I think of Cosmos as a database that works really well for kind of the examples that you hear a lot around games and things like that. But certainly manufacturing data, or different kind of commercial applications where someone is needing to kind of unify data from across the globe into a data warehouse. Cosmos works really well for that. It's multi-mastered. It allows you to kind of do regional reads and writes, but Cosmos isn't necessarily the best at being able to perform, big data analytics. It's linked with Synapse, and it allows us to actually read the data that's sitting out in Cosmos. But here's a kind of example Parquet file. And what I wanted to kind of show you is obviously we can read this. I can read it. Something's going haywire. I'm going to try one more time. But actually, what I really wanted to show was the wizard to be able to create external data. Okay, so something's not happy with my demo. The thing that I was really wanting to try to show is the ability to kind of create external tables or do bulk loads of this. So for those that have worked with Yeah, all right, so I can't, for some reason, I can't read this file. Let me try to find a different, bear with me, where I try to maybe go after, just going against a different files off of a HANA data source. But with the ability to take this data that sits in Data Lake Store and bring it into a SQL pool table, make an external table off of that. A little bit involved, the polybase logic to do that, but what I can do is I can create a new table and it will help me look at the schema that is there. And if the wizard can also offer the ability for us to, I guess I didn't hit the option, but it can help give us the ability to kind of read the schema that sits inside that file. And the file names, perhaps the file names are not embedded into that file. And actually define a table that has the right schema name. But I can go ahead and run this, and I'm really pushing my luck here because I didn't pre-work out whether this one's going to. Okay, it did. It built the table. Okay, so but the point is, though, I have the ability to, in my data hub, I can work with provisioned SQL, or I can work with compute that is on demand. I can also work with data that is sitting out in either a Cosmos database, in Azure Data Lake Storage, or even data sets that I perhaps curated, kind of use the Azure Data Factory to kind of actually produce a data set. Let's move on to the next. The next hub is the Develop Hub. And I'd just like to clean up my window here a little bit. I didn't practice this for time, Nicole, so hopefully I'm not running too late or too soon. But in the Develop Hub, this is where you're going to build either your SQL scripts, your notebooks for your ML workloads, or your data flows. So this is the place where, again, if I want to query data, this is an example of, you probably have all seen this from different demos, but this is like a 35 billion row query that was just fired against, a very large set of data that we have, and again, showing how that can be executed against with Azure Synapse Analytics. So it's certainly capable of running, and I don't even have it really scaled to a very large set of DWUs, but I'm able to, build my SQL queries. I can do things like, read JSON files. So here's a typical JSON file. Here's an example of that same JSON file, but actually formatted. I have examples where I can do dynamic data masking, column level security, row level security, bring in external data from something like Cosmos or external data. In fact, these are examples here of pulling data from a Cosmos database using what's called Synapse Link notebooks. Now,
I think Nicole has a question, but I'm not understanding what she chatted, so I'm going to encourage her to unmute and ask it.
Yeah, Chris, I see you going after different data sets via your scripts. Where do you put your workload? When do you put your workload there versus Azure Data Factory?
Well, you can certainly you can work with Azure Data Factory via, you can go out to Azure Data Factory and launch the Data Factory workspace itself and work in that separate environment, or you can build those things, those same Data Factory things, right here in Synapse. So again, remember, we're trying to have a single pane of glass. This is not to say that you can't do what you're used to going out to Azure Data Factory and building these same data flows. You can do that there, or you can link. You can add. We can link in that data flow into the Synapse workspace. so that I have this one pane of glass where I can, you know, fuss around with my data flow, maybe go back to working on a Spark job, you know, come back to my data flow, or, you know, maybe work on some SQL. That's in fact, there's also the ability to come into Power BI, and in fact, that is my environment is not catching up with me. Nicole, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
I am confused as to why my Power BI environment should show here, where I'm able to actually kind of build. I can link into a Power BI workspace in this environment, and now that I have my data, I've constructed my physical data warehouse the way I want to. And perhaps I've used a pipeline and a data flow to load that data the way I want to. I can then come into Power BI and build a report directly off of that.
So the data flow is just like building pipelines in ADF, and it can connect to on-prem data sources?
Yes, it can. Yep. So this is fundamentally Azure Data Factory. This is Azure Data Factory. It's just wrapped into Synapse. Okay.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Okay, so this is bugging me why I cannot see my Power BI. Did it go away? No. Okay, now it's shown up. Here's my Power BI environment where I'm able to register a Power BI workspace into Synapse, and then I have direct access into those Power BI files to build reports. So I'm able to build my, this is an example of that same 35 billion row, data model, but this is just fundamentally a Power BI report in a workspace that Synapse Studio is aware of. Maybe you're more comfortable using Power BI Desktop to kind of author, but if you've been working with Power BI a long time, you realize that the experience in the web view or the desktop view is, pretty much on par. Yep. So this is Power BI Workspace. I can build new reports, and I can edit data sets and things like that, and publish directly from here.
Excuse me. This is great from a perspective of a developer or administrator making these Power BI reports. Do you have anything you're going to be talking about comparisons to end user tools like MicroStrategy? Does Synapse have anything that helps the real non-developer end user? Like MicroStrategy has things that just allow people to pick from the corporate approved library and grab the fields they want and not know anything else about relationships. IBM has Query Studio. Is there anything in there that relates to Synapse?
Yeah. I think that is probably a player to be named later. But we do have things. This really doesn't get after your question about the Q&A, the ability to kind of do natural language query over the data. But where I'm going to come back to the slide deck here.
Some of that's done with Azure Analysis Services.
That's absolutely right. Some of that is done with Azure Analysis Services. There's an element of me that
your end users don't log into Azure Analysis Services.
No.
Okay.
I mean, Azure Analysis Services allows you to connect it to a data model, and as an end user, you can connect to the data model. You don't have to even worry about the relationships or anything. You can consume the data model. But
right. it allows you to build that abstraction layer like MicroStrategy has.
Yeah.
For the business users.
Okay. But doesn't also MicroStrategy give you an end user tool where they just go to a screen and start grabbing what they want?
Yeah. Similar to Power BI.
Yeah, I am not. I'm not super familiar with MicroStrategy, but honestly, this is a bit that I have a bit of faith on. This is still an evolving story, but our Azure Data Catalog, if you've been kind of following that, it's I don't believe it'll be relaunched as Azure Data Catalog. It's currently referred to as Babylon as a code name, and I have seen it. It is very, very far along, but catalog, aka Babylon, does far more than just help you find data. It has pieces that are around GDPR and compliance, and other pieces that are there. And if you're familiar with Atlas, as it sits inside the Apache world, it kind of has approaches things kind of similar, the same types of things that Atlas does. But Paul, I think if that, where
I think that answers the question, because it was basically coming out of the chat where people are kind of like, okay, end user wise, is Synapse thinking in terms of having a direct to end user thing?
Yeah,
the closest you get right now is Power BI. Yeah,
remember, this is meant for the, it's meant, from a persona standpoint, this is meant for the ETL engineer, the data quality engineer, the data scientist, the operations teams have the ability to come in and kind of monitor, pieces that are running in your environment. This is not really meant for an end user to kind of come out here and start kind of building, consuming things.
Yep, makes sense.
So I want to come back. I didn't touch enough on the notebooks, but the notebooks environment, this gives us some abilities to do things like I have this kind of, I thought this was an interesting example. This is just a little fake demo that we've got. But in this fake demo, it's a website where I'm able to kind of manage its health and safety portal for Vulkan. But the thing that really intrigued me was around, oh, come on, Chris. Yeah, this is what I was looking for. In Azure, in our cognitive capabilities we have out in Azure, we have some things that are around vision, computer vision, to be able to kind of look at a scene and see something that's wrong with that, right? So in this case, I'm the safety officer, and you might have seen demos that we have that can look at video streams and tell if someone's wearing a hard hat or not wearing a hard hat. And so we can detect, in scene recognition, we can detect in that scene, from a COVID standpoint, even are people too close or people too far apart. But in order to solve these kinds of problems, you have to be able to see the issue. And if this is probably okay, and or maybe the model didn't catch this, but I as a human caught it, I may want to retrain my model. And I'm able to kind of classify my data and say, this is the kind of problem that I'm seeing. And what this could actually do is save this data up to Azure Data Lake Store, right? In Azure Data Lake Store, then would give me the ability to go ahead and retrain my model. So the retraining of my model isn't something that would probably happen on the factory floor, but I sure could come out to a, this is an example maybe of the hard hat that I was kind of talking about, but using a notebook against my Spark pool, I'm able to use PySpark as my language, and it's not so heavily important about the code, but it is calling out to our custom vision algorithm, taking those photos that have been labeled as what type of safety hazard it was, or if it wasn't a hazard at all, it could retrain and then re-provision that model. So, again, these notebooks that I have here are mainly around doing things like trying to identify a defective part as an example. This, I think, has got some examples where it's showing, training the model to show, good part, a bad part, defective part. But the notebooks give us the ability to run, load up different libraries in Spark. We are able to, like in any notebook technology, you can run cell by cell or kind of run the entire notebook, and not only view the data, but I can also analyze the data too, right in this environment as I'm trying to build models. So this is how Synapse is trying to address the enterprise data warehousing workloads along with the big data workloads in a single pane of glass, giving us the ability to work off of provisioned SQL or on-demand SQL, provisioned Spark or on-demand Spark, build data flows and pipelines to kind of stitch things together to kind of move data around where I need it to be able to do the enterprise BI that I need to do. From an operations perspective, be able to secure it, manage it, observe it, and really being able to kind of link into all of the different services that might be important in my environment. So this is an example of, when I wanted to connect to Power BI, I'm able to connect to Power BI. But again, our goal, just like with Azure Data Factory, is, and also, something like Power BI is just to offer all of the connectors wherever your data lives. If it's data, it's files, it's NoSQL, it's different services and apps and things like that, be able to connect to it, bring it all into one environment, and allow you to kind of live up to that promise where you're able to do your enterprise BI as well as your big data analytics. So with that, I think maybe we'll kind of transition to any further Q&A, or if there might be any other confusing things that Microsoft has in Azure, I'd be happy to try to entertain anything.
Nice. Thanks for the presentation. I'd say at this point, Nicole, we'd basically invite everyone to type in questions or unmute. We'll move into our QA section of the meeting and give people a chance to talk, ask Chris questions, or ask each other questions. What do you think?
Sounds great.
All right. If anyone is heading out and not going to stick around for Q&A, please take a note for yourselves and thank Chris. Find him out there and send him a message thanking him for coming to our meetup. Please do.
It'd sure be fun to be in person at some point. I look forward to that.
Yeah. All right. You have a question. If you feel comfortable unmuting, do so now.
Thanks, Chris. It was a wonderful presentation. The question that I have is, I was all the time talking about a client is already having Azure SQL Data Warehouse. So when I logged into their Azure portal, what it shows to me is the Azure SQL Data Warehouse formerly, the previous version. So now what do I need to do to take them to Azure Synapse? And does that have a cost factor into it? Say, for example, if I try to create a Azure Synapse workspace and take all my assets in there, ADF is lying somewhere else, and then the SQL pool is somewhere else. What exactly are the steps? And can you lead me to some migration path or whatever you call it as?
Yeah, so I'd be curious to know, do you happen to have this icon show up in your Azure SQL Data Warehouse where they're able to see this? Otherwise, all that's really necessary, if you're not seeing this, is to come out to Synapse Analytics, go to Workspace Preview, and you're going to create an Azure Synapse Analytics workspace. You'll be able to link in the data warehouse that you have existing into this environment.
Okay, yeah. So I don't see the Launch Studio, and I think I can create the workspace. I do see this creation thing. The moment I create, is this going to have extra cost on some of the components?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's. So the best way to get an answer on the pricing. is I like to go to the pricing calculator. If the company that you're working with has an enterprise agreement, it's important to sign in. So if you're with the credentials that represent the company that you're working with, because when we come down to analytics, this builds a bit of a bill of materials, and so I'm Azure Synapse Analytics is what I'm after, and it adds it down in here. So again, what I'm trying to get at is you can add a bunch of other things as well. Maybe you want to add, I don't know, analysis services, and it winds up building a kind of a trick that many people don't notice right away is you can label these things. And then you can save them. You can even forward them. But you're able to, pick where you're, more or less the pricing is the same regionally, but there will be differences in real estate costs and electricity costs and things like that. So you got to pick your region, and you can see that we're really what I'm trying to get at is you're really being charged for the compute that you're using, the Spark, but there's really no, I'm not aware of any cost for the studio. So if the studio is up and running and just sitting there, I'm not really aware of any cost for that. And so as a matter of fact, one of the things that I like to do, I keep a close eye to my costs for my own Azure environment. And this is just some stuff I've got in a resource group. And notice that I'm looking at a resource group, and all these things are in that resource group. I can come down to cost analysis. Chris, what's going on? It might be confused because I've got an in private window, but the cost analysis should come up, and I should be able to prove whether I'm being charged for the studio or not. And this is the cost for my resource group for September, and what I've been charged for is for the database. I have a regular SQL database. I have a SQL data warehouse. I have some security turned on. I have some log analytics turned on. I have some storage, some bandwidth. So there's nothing, to my knowledge, there's nothing about Synapse Studio itself that you're going to be charged for. It's going to be your storage and your compute.
Right, got it.
I don't know if it's a recommendation that you'd give, but one thing I've done over time to try and get familiar with Azure costs and how it kind of works is I have a Visual Studio Professional subscription, which gives me $50 a month of things to do in Azure. And so I've spun up things like last year to get some sense of Azure SQL Data Warehouse. I actually spun one up in that $50 subscription and watched it stay up for 2 days before it ran out of money. So
yeah, I mean that's right.
Nice use of the Visual Studio Professional subscription to really understand what's happening with Azure for free, essentially with the $50, or at least for the cost of a Visual Studio Professional subscription.
But I'm glad you mentioned that, because a unique thing about Synapse is that it can be paused. So especially for I've got some of the teams in the customer that I work with today. They have projects that they do once a year, kind of budgeting projects and things like that. So they'll do that study in Synapse. And then when they're done with the study, they'll just pause the compute. There's some storage costs that go along with that, but by and far the bigger part of the bill is going to be the compute. So they'll pause the compute, and then next year when they want to dust everything off, they'll come back out to the workspace, power things on and pick up where they left off. And that's something that's unique about Synapse.
And I've also seen things where I spun up like a little storage area within that same area that only had $50 of credit a month, and watched it use over the entire, not really being used, $3. So it was always up. So
right, yeah.
You had another question. I interrupted you. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So Chris, so there was an ADF, lot of pipelines written, then there was SQL, Azure SQL Data Warehouse, and then there was Azure Cube Analysis Service. So if I create a workspace, Synapse workspace, excuse me. Sorry.
No, go
So
ahead.
do I need to move it or link it?
Yeah, so what you'll wind up doing is you may, as an example, you may have more than one data lake storage. Some customers that I work with have one giant data lake store. Others will have maybe half a dozen. You know, it's conceivable you might have an HR only data lake. And you can just connect to it. So you can connect to your external data or your data sets or your Synapse database. So if I want to connect to my existing SQL data warehouse, I would connect to that pool. Oh, I've got to go to the managed pools, and this is where I would be able to connect to it. I'm sorry, you said analysis services and things like that. Analysis services is not something that's directly, at least currently, embedded in here. That's something that you would continue to kind of go externally to that. And then it would connect to either the SQL pool or the on-demand SQL.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
And I think I have, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to ask a question about, so between the on-demand and the pool, does the on-demand actually store it? It looks like the pool stores it as like an actual SQL database.
It does, yeah.
Yeah. So does on-demand do the same thing?
No, the data is sitting at rest in the data lake store. So it's accessing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you have to use your data factory or your pipeline to get it there first before you can take advantage of the on-demand?
Yes. Today, the on-demand is, I think, exclusively able to allow you to work with data that's in Azure storage.
Okay.
So the data lake storage. My understanding is that.
But you showed a Cognos. Is that Cognos inside of Azure that you showed?
Cognos.
Not Cognos, Cosmos.
Cosmo.
Yeah. I guess what I'm trying to say is that the that Cosmos link is actually Cosmos files that are sitting in Azure Data Lake storage. Is what those are. It's Cosmos kind of dumping into that environment.
Okay.
My understanding is that the on-demand SQL. So if you happen to have a regular SQL database in your environment, which I'm sure you do, my understanding is that on-demand SQL will be able to connect to other external data sources. But remember, this is it's in public preview, and we have a V3 that is on the horizon. So I'm hopeful that we'll see a major announcement with the pieces that are today in public preview going to GA yet this year. I don't know if that will or will not happen, but after you work at Microsoft long enough and you hear, I can tell you this: the teams do not release until they're ready, and it's not because some marketing person says, "Hey, we need to release at this conference." It's like when it's ready, it's ready. But everything I've seen has been really solid. It's been performing well. I haven't seen a lot of people having issues and things like that. So I'm feeling good that it's going to, relatively soon, we'll have a next big release of the preview features into general availability. And then there's the next piece, which is the V3, and there's some exciting things on the roadmap for V3.
Okay.
I got a question from the chat that's talking about a migration path for existing multi-dimensional cubes. Is there a migration path or something equivalent that you could talk to?
Yeah, good question. I would have to, if you wanted to drop me a note, I would be happy to try to look tomorrow to see if there's anything new on the roadmap for Azure Analysis Services as an example to bring in multidimensional models, because Azure Analysis Services today can do the tabular models. But I have everything that I have seen is that the team is committed to supporting the multidimensional models as well.
Oh, all right. How do you want to be dropped a line? Do you want your email?
Sure, it's right here, chfle@microsoft.com is, you can hit me at chris.fleming@microsoft.com, or the short way, chfle@microsoft.com is my alias.
Great.
So
thanks, appreciate it. Any other questions? Feel free to unmute now and jump in. One of the things that occurred to me, Chris, was the waters are pretty murky. I thank you for trying to unmurk them as best you can, but we're at the cusp of rewriting a bunch of stuff in Azure Data Factory and using Azure Lake Storage Gen 2 and trying to understand when is it that we should be not bothering with any of that and just jumping right into Synapse. And that's still pretty murky in terms of, well, is Synapse have all the exact same things we're doing in Azure Data Factory? Like, why are we bothering with that? You know?
Yeah, I think so. That's a good question, but the work that if you are in Azure Data Factory today, that work that you're building there, you can bring that forward into this Synapse Studio.
Okay.
So you can bring that forward.
There are a couple things that I've bumped into that I don't know that Synapse is ready for. Like, we started to get into this and be better about continuous integration, continuous deployment.
I was just going to say that.
DevOps stuff, and Synapse isn't there yet.
No, I was just, thank you. You just read my mind, because I think those are the pieces. If there was a gap in Azure Data Factory, it's, to my knowledge, the DevOps portion is not finished being baked yet.
Yeah.
So not to say that it won't be. It will be. It will be dealt with. But I don't believe that is currently there.
Sure. Good. Thanks.
But I'm glad you're doing that. In fact, that's going to be my life next week. Is we've got an internal conference. And I'll be doing a hackathon or a hack all week on DevOps. So I've worked a fair amount in DevOps, but there's a lot more that I want to learn, especially how things interact with GitHub and things like that. So maybe I'll have we connect after next week. I might have a different answer for you, Paul. So
yeah, makes sense.
Hey, Chris,
I have a question.
Sorry, Chris, I have a question about data flow. So under the hood, data flow is using Data Factory, or there is no relation?
No, it is. We don't necessarily really call it Data Factory in here, but if you look through it, I mean, it's pipelines and it's data flows and pipelines. So the wrangling data flows and those pieces that you're used to seeing, this Data Factory, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So basically it is using Data Factory, but we call it data flow.
Correct. Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Data flows and pipelines. Yep.
Okay.
Question from the chat was that there's a mention that Azure SQL Data Warehouse was not really for huge numbers of end users doing queries. Like, it's more of a big data processing engine. But if you were like, I have 1,000 users and they all run on one really intense queries. I'm familiar with that world, being a former DBA that had to deal with the uptime of an on-premise SQL server that was being hit by everybody and their brother every 5 minutes with a new ad hoc query. So that's what I think when I hear the question. What would someone say? Well, Azure SQL Data Warehouse or Azure Synapse, is it really about turning end users loose to do a ton of ad hoc queries against what's in it? I don't know if you have any commentary on that.
Well, I do, yeah. So there is this, with these larger, MPP, massively parallel environments, there is, so early on, I was looking for a slide. I don't know that I have it available here, but there's this concept of concurrency and concurrent slots, and ultimately, one of the bullets that I was reading off was about workload isolation. So I want to say conceptually the concern is still there, where it may not be the best for thousands of people executing queries simultaneously against that environment. That's why you have things like analysis services and other layers to serve those things. But we're working on it, and so we do have things that we're doing to improve. So stay tuned to that. It is being addressed. It's being addressed partly in the V2. I alluded to some of the caching and some of those pieces that are part of what makes up Synapse, but there's some pieces in the V3 roadmap as well that is addressing this.
Sure.
I don't know that it will arise to the same level as I'm not on the engineering team, so I can't speak for them. But there's certainly things that SQL itself can do in terms of supporting thousands of users versus something like a kind of a large analytic environment. So.
Sure. And if I were forced to answer that, not being a Microsoft person or thinking as much about it on your end, it'd be, in my world, that takes the form of thinking, okay, if I have lots of users, then what am I doing about the reporting interface or the query interface or that interface to give them fast and responsive and memory driven? And there's where I get into, well, cubes and tabular and Power BI. So it's not about ad hoc SQL table relationships, letting people loose on tables like that. It's about building out all the way to the end where there's query or data sets that are cubes and OLAP for them to get faster response with lots of users.
Yeah, that's right. You've got that, with Power BI, you've got the ability to do, full import, which is going to be, the best because it's in memory, to direct query, and somewhere in between, you've got the aggregates models, where you can have this, have query rewrites, some of the analysis being performed from an in-memory cache versus things that are being, fetched out directly from for that lower grain data.
Yep. And that's just provided you can get people to a world of, I think, Power BI visualizations and cubes, which is less about, I just want to be able to select 500,000 rows and send them to Excel. Thank you.
Right.
I don't really want to enable you to do that.
Right. Yeah.
So I have a question on the governor.
Sure. Yep.
Maybe you have some data science people that are coming in direct. Maybe they're using SQL, whatever. But then what if you have some people coming in via Power BI? Does that governor see Power BI as the individual users, or does it see it just as Power BI, and can it govern those users?
Yeah, yes, you can. It depends on how the connection's being made. If it's being made with like a service principal account or the actual end user account, and yeah, you can govern the users. Yep.
Oh, okay.
Yep. I'm looking to see if I can quickly find any slides that talk about workload management. Yeah. Okay. So I've just quickly brought up a different deck, but there's different resource classes you can build to define limits for the users. So if you need to be able to kind of govern the amount of query, memory, and things like that that are available to a end user, you have these different resource classes. So for those that have worked with data warehousing before, Azure SQL Data Warehouse before, they probably have seen these resource classes. So with the resource classes, you can define how much memory and how many max concurrent queries that you're able to build. What else? We have the concurrency slots to guarantee access to resources. The queries are assigned to a concurrency slot. So that's kind of this concept. And depending on what scale of a data warehouse, you'll have a variety of different concurrency slots available to you. And I don't know if 128 is the limit or not. I'd have to go back and look. see, that's the max, but I do know there's some things that are being addressed in the roadmap that kind of address concurrent queries. Then there's workload classification. And again, this gets to the workload isolation. So you can map queries into predefined roles. So you gain that flexibility. And I think this slide is a little bit, yeah, you can define kind of workload importance where, certain kinds of analysts have certain kind of, privileges, but someone else is, needs to have a higher level and they can jump to the top of the queue.
Mhm.
It's an area that I haven't poked around in too much, to be honest with you, but yeah, conceptually this is being addressed in what Synapse is trying to do.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Nice. Any other questions? Feel free to unmute or turn on your webcam or chat with us. Are you doing any special prep in your world for Ignite coming up?
Well, so we've got what we call Digital Transformation Academy that's next week, and it's sort of it's a melancholy time for all of us because none of us are traveling anymore, right? And
Yep.
and we used to go out to this event would be held out in Las Vegas typically, and it was always great to see people that you haven't met in a long time, and it was we worked really hard and had a lot of fun out there as well. But my conference next week will be actually really long day. It'll be a let me see if I can actually find this. This might be the best slide, the best link that people didn't stick around to the very end to see, but we have these open hacks. Have you seen these before, Paul?
No, I have not.
We used to have these events at Microsoft offices called open hacks. And these open hacks, free, no cost to attend other than your travel to get there. Now they're really being handled virtually. And we have open hacks. This is kind of what they look like on premise. A lot of fun, a bunch of people, and you're just there all day long, grinding away on an open hack challenge. They're not easy, let me tell you. But we've got one around modern data warehousing. This would cover Synapse. It would cover ADF and Power BI and all those pieces. It's a great one to attend. That was the first one I ever did. It was really challenging. There's another one around AI-powered knowledge mining that I've done. This one is more around using some of the cognitive services and extracting meaning out of data. The one I'm doing next week is around DevOps. And so this is going to be, kind of, it talks about what these are. You can get the definitions, but it's a matter of looking at, this is the current schedule. These are ones you can just register for. So there's one on containers, there's one on app modernization with NoSQL. There's a serverless one that, again, this would be a great one to register for if you want to get into. What happened is you get paired into a team of about 6, and people you might have worked with or not worked with, and as a team you have to figure out how to solve the challenge. That's part of the open hack.
Interesting.
So yeah, highly recommend. I mean, it's some of the best long grilling days, to be honest with you, but that's some of the best experiences that I've I hate to call it training because it's not like somebody's training you. It's like, sit down, here you go, figure it out. And so it's self-paced as the team. And what happens is there's these challenges that open up. So you have to do the first challenge. You have to present what you did to the proctor for your table. And if the proctor thinks you met the challenge, they open up the next thing, and that next challenge builds upon the first challenge, and so on and so forth.
Huh. Interesting.
And they're a ton of fun to go.
Good share.
I check it out, and you can go ahead, and if there's registration open, you can go ahead and register for them, and
Yeah, nice.
So that's my next week.
Ah, cool.
So,
I know that we've we had plans to go to a Ignite tour before COVID, and then everything happened. So as we are adjusting to what will we do instead, let's double down on online events. And good to see Ignite is coming. And
Yeah.
thank you for coming to meetups like this, because getting these organized and having people come to talk has been good. Take advantage of the online format and getting people from anywhere.
Well, appreciate you giving me the opportunity. Nicole, when we first talked about this, I didn't ever imagine our summer would turn out the way it was. But in fact, today, I don't know, I was just going to ask if anybody's got their heat on. We have our heat on in our house. I can't even believe that. So
That's why I have a jacket on tonight.
It crossed my mind to use my fireplace a little bit. I'm not gonna lie. Earlier today, I'm like, you know what? It might be nice.
Nice.
all right. Well, thank you so much,
I think
everybody.
we're good with questions. Thanks so much, Chris. And for anyone, last call questions. We're going to start wrapping it up. And tune in to next time. Get on the meetup and sign up RSVP, and that'll get on your calendar for the next one in October. So thanks everybody for coming tonight.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Chris, Paul, and
Thank
Nicole. Thank you.
See you later.
See ya.
Go Pointers.